I just watched one of the most horrifying videos I've ever seen. I've seen videos of beheadings, people being burned alive, women being stoned, and so on. But this is worse. It won't seem like it if you're not paying close attention, but if you listen carefully to what's being said, you realize that according to CNN, criticizing Muhammad is not protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the reason I say that this is worse than videos of violent atrocities is that if we're no longer allowed to criticize an ideology that promotes violent atrocities, we're going to see a lot more videos of violent atrocities. Here's a little background to the video. Muhammad ordered his followers to brutally murder those who make fun of him. Nearly 14 centuries later, people like Salman Rushdie or Lars Vilks or Theo van Gogh or the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists either have to go into hiding or they get killed. But terrorism isn't an end in itself. Terrorism is a tool in the jihadist's tool belt for reaching a goal. Critics of jihad and Sharia know that if terrorism starts having the opposite of its intended effect, in this case, if killing cartoonists causes people to make fun of Muhammad even more instead of silencing them, jihadists will become less eager to use the tool, terrorism, because it won't help reach the goal. So, in response to the Charlie Hebdo massacre, Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer put together a Muhammad cartoon contest. The point wasn't to offend for the sake of offending, but to send a message to terrorists. If you kill cartoonists, we're going to make even more cartoons, so if you don't want people drawing your profit, stop killing cartoonists and learn to disagree in a more constructive manner. The response of jihadists, of course, was to launch a terrorist attack against the cartoon exhibit. Nothing surprising there. Terrorism still has its intended effect of silencing politicians and the media, so jihadists view terrorism as an effective tool. What should be surprising, but for some reason isn't, is that news networks like CNN are using a terrorist attack on a cartoon exhibit as an opportunity to condemn not only the victims, but also the constitutional rights that allow us to criticize jihad, Sharia, honor killings, female genital mutilation, and so on. Here's CNN anchor Alisyn Camerota suggesting that there's a difference between, on the one hand, constitutionally protected free speech, and on the other hand, speech that's incendiary and provocative, where cartoons fall into the incendiary and provocative category.
Yes, but what people are saying is that there's always this fine line, between freedom of speech and being intentionally incendiary and provocative.
So free speech and provocative speech may seem like the same thing to Pamela Geller, but there's a fine line between them. What do you think of that, Pamela?
Intentionally incendiary and provocative by drawing a cartoon. This is the low state of freedom of speech in this country.
If CNN wants to say that there's a difference between offensive speech and inoffensive speech, fine. But when the network declares that there's a difference between offensive speech and speech that's protected by the U.S. Constitution, free speech over here, line, offensive speech on the other side of the line, we've got a problem. You'd expect the media to know that both offensive speech and inoffensive speech are forms of protected speech. But maybe Alisyn misspoke. Let's give her another try.
But there is a debate to be had about what the line is between freedom of speech and provocation.
Now it's not even a fine line, it's just a line between free speech and provocation. And we need to have a debate about the line between free speech and provocative speech, where provocative speech is, again, cartoons.
But there is a debate to be had about what the line is between freedom of speech and provocation.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
There's no line between free speech and provocative speech. Provocative speech is free speech. And what's interesting is that CNN only thinks we need to debate this line between free speech and provocative speech when the provocative speech happens to be about Islam. When South Park makes fun of Mormonism or Scientology, when Saturday Night Live does skits about Jesus, we don't hear a peep about how we need to rethink the line between free speech and provocative speech. Islam, according to CNN, is uniquely beyond criticism. I wonder how CNN came to the exact same conclusion that Sharia demands.
You want worldwide a law to be in every country that you cannot criticize the prophet. Is that accurate?
Well, we want the Sharia, and the Sharia says that this is completely prohibited.
Okay.
Yes, but what people are saying is that there's always this fine line, you know, between freedom of speech and being intentionally incendiary and provocative.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
The response to people who kill over cartoons should be, it's a cartoon. Grow up. If it offends you, live with it, like the rest of us do when something offends us. But if you're planning to throw a violent tantrum every time someone says something about your poor little prophet, prepare for relentless mockery, because the best thing we can do for you and for future generations is make sure you get used to it real fast. Instead, politicians and the media respond to cartoon violence with sympathy for the perpetually outraged. We feel your pain. We understand your perpetual outrage. We agree with you that drawing a cartoon of an illiterate 7th century caravan trader who had sex with a 9-year-old girl and won followers by promising them an eternity of deflowering virgins is a terrible tragedy. And rather than bring you into the 21st century, we're going to treat you like children, because deep down, we're a bunch of liberal racists who don't think you're capable of behaving like adults, so why bother trying?
You know, a quarter of the world's population revere the messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you know, for them, they'll prefer to die themselves than to allow anyone to insult the Prophet. Now, people in the West should understand that we live in a very unstable and insecure world today, which you can see very well now in Paris, what the consequences of insulting the Prophet are. And what we're saying is that the sensibilities and the emotions of Muslims must be taken into consideration in the context in which we live today.
The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam.
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
The saddest part about CNN's stance is that by agreeing with jihadists that criticizing Muhammad is in a completely different category from criticizing anyone else, the network is encouraging future violence. Alisyn says in her discussion with Pamela that violence is unacceptable and that Pamela does have a right to criticize Islam. But by turning right around and proclaiming that drawing a picture of Muhammad is so heinous that we need to rethink the boundaries of free speech, she's telling terrorists that our rights are negotiable, that we as a civilization are still on the fence about free speech, and that if pushed hard enough, we might just come down on the Sharia side of things. Quite an encouraging message for future jihadists. So, keep feeding the crocodile, CNN. Maybe it will eat you last.